First, divine simplicity means that we should not emphasize one divine attribute against another as if there's a conflict between them. So, for example, there's a popular understanding that before Jesus came and died on the cross, there's a strife in God's being between, for example, his compassion and justice, or his love and holiness. But I think some of these errors can be mitigated by understanding divine simplicity again. So, by understanding simplicity, it is in fact impossible to think that there's a strife or conflict between God's justice and mercy, for example. It is also an overly anthropomorphic reading of texts that seem to indicate change from wrath to love in God, when there are clearly other texts that indicate otherwise. So the title of my presentation is Something Perfect from Something Perfect, the dogmatic and apologetic functions of divine simplicity. So I'll start by introducing the need of discussing this doctrine. So Christian theology has long regarded the attribute of simplicity as part and parcel with classical understanding of God. But divine simplicity has fallen out of favor since modernity, and the reasons for its rejection and objections to it are still being rehearsed even until this very moment. In my own context, you can call it the Eastern, Asian, and more specifically Indonesian context. In the last few decades, or maybe even in the history of the theological development, there's almost no new engagement or retrieval, perhaps to the point of neglect of the doctrine, as witnessed in some recent publications. So in December 2023, less than a month ago, a new, maybe the first even systematic theology of, I would say, the deep quality, did not mention the word simplicity or discuss, even when there's a section on the unity of God. The word simplicity is left out. And if we have the big tomb, the massive tomb edited by Gene Green, Stephen Pardue, and K.K. Yao, it's called Majority World Theology. Even though it has a section on the Trinity, on God, but I find no substantial discussion on simplicity there, even by the Western theologian Gerald Bray in one of the chapter there. Maybe people ask why? Why is this lack of discussion? I would think maybe the more charitable analysis would be something like Christian philosopher, theologian Nicholas Walterstorff. Once he recounted a story. He's trying to find the discussion of simplicity in Calvin Institute, and he didn't find any meaningful discussion on simplicity. And he mentioned that the reason probably because Calvin did not regard divine simplicity as a topic of burning importance for the life of the church in that boisterous refugee city, which was Geneva. That's his words. So probably to the Indonesians or to the eastern part of the world, maybe simplicity is just too abstract, too philosophical, doesn't have any relevance. Maybe people thought that way. So even though maybe people, when explain about simplicity, does not necessarily, they will reject it or something, but perhaps then Christians today implicitly affirm simplicity without feeling the urgency, to keep restating and defending it. Or maybe even in my own context, it has translation issues. Maybe people think it's just too difficult. So the closest thing that we can translate simplicity to in Indonesian is just perfection, equal. So the word kesempurnaan in Indonesia means perfection. But if you translate it directly, it just means modesty, simple. You cannot really translate it to the precise words that paints the whole picture of what the classical theologians would have it, by teaching simplicity. That's the more charitable interpretation of the lack. But I suspect, that this kind of lack is because, not only that, one author says most Christians have not even heard of the doctrine of simplicity. It's more likely because, as one says in a recent textbook on theology by Richard Plantinga, Thomas Thompson, and Matthew Lundberg, and I quote, "The reason is because simplicity has no real biblical basis and has in fact worked to defeat the resources of a full-fledged Trinitarianism." So in my estimation, such comments betray to us how many of us have failed to observe our own Catholic tradition since, because as Richard Moller, the prominent historian and historical theologian, he states that the doctrine of divine simplicity is among the normative assumptions of theology from the time of the Church Fathers to the age of great medieval scholastic systems to the era of Reformation and post-Reformation theology, and indeed continued on to orthodoxy and rationalism. I mean, there's still versions of it, even though it's getting less and less mentioned. But I mean, it's a part of very important to the Christian faith. We somehow have not paid attention to able thinkers like Irenaeus, Augustine, Gregory of Nyssa, Thomas Aquinas, or even confessional documents like the Belgic Confession, Augsburg Confession, Westminster Confession of Faith, 39 Articles of Religion. I can go on and on. So I guess people are just forgetting about simplicity and especially the true meaning of it and what it was for. This presentation, this paper, has a twofold aim to demonstrate why, again, this doctrine of divine simplicity is indispensable to the Christian faith. So first, I summarize how theologians across the centuries have used simplicity to ground and support these biblical doctrines, the following doctrines, without which the Christian faith cannot be meaningfully defended. So the three doctrines are, one, the Trinity, incarnation, and atonement. So without simplicity, you cannot understand these three doctrines well. And secondly, not just dogmatically it is indispensable, but I argue that we will lose so much opportunity to dialogue with especially our Muslim brothers and sisters. And I established this argument by retrieving some of the ways in which our early Arab Christian theologians and apologists have attempted to convince their Muslim interlocutors that Christians do not worship three gods. So my presentation is actually very simple, has two parts, the dogmatic functions and the apologetic function. And so let us go to the first part, which is the dogmatic function. I give the subtitle, How Simplicity Changes Everything. There are many ways that people define divine simplicity, but we can at least agree with one theologian, Stephen Holmes, that I quote, describe God as simple means that God is ontologically basic. Any attribution of ontological complexity, any postulation of distinction or division into ontological parts is excluded by this doctrine. And many of the confessional documents that I mentioned earlier agree that it is essential to add to the clear biblical affirmations that, for example, in the Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 1.1, it says there's but one only living and true God. It's in Deuteronomy 6:4, Isaiah 44, Isaiah 45. I mean, it's everywhere, right? That there's just one God exclusively. But it's not enough for the Westminster divines. They add that this God is infinite in being and perfection, a most pure spirit, invisible, and this is the important part, without body, parts, or passions. And the exact phrase without body, parts, or passions are repeated by the 39 Articles of Religion, for example. And what is the significance of that additional explanation about God? So James Dolezal, his published dissertation entitled God Without Parts, and I quote, so this curious verbiage signifies the Westminster divines' commitment to the simplicity that enables Christians to meaningfully confess that God is most absolute in his existence and attributes. Adherents to this doctrine reason that if God were composed of parts in any sense, he would be dependent upon those parts for his very being, and thus the parts would be ontologically prior to him. So God no longer is ontologically basic. And he continues that if this were the case, he would not be most absolute, that is, wholly self-sufficient and the first principle of all other things. Thus, only if God is without parts can he be most absolute. Francis Turretin, sometimes called the Protestant Aquinas, he likewise explains why it is necessary to say that God is perfectly simple and free from all composition. And these are his reasons. First, if God is independent, or ase, which the word aseity comes from, then he cannot be composite, for whatever is composed by another. And he continues to say, if God is singular and absolute, then he can neither be divided nor composed for something would have to precede God and put his being and all its parts together. And if God is truly perfect, then he cannot be composite again, because it implies his words, passive potency, dependency, and mutability. Therefore, as he says, God receives no perfection from another. That is why even critics like Alvin Plantinga, for example, says that the sovereignty-aseity intuition behind the doctrine of divine simplicity must be taken with real seriousness. This is because even when simplicity may not have a direct proof text, this doctrine is really a consequence of the many biblical affirmations about God, especially that God is sovereign over all things and independent of all things. We find such affirmations in Exodus 3:33, Acts 17:24-28, and Romans 9. In other words, rejecting simplicity means that the absolute sovereignty and aseity of God is questionable. And Stephen Holmes further suggests another reason why simplicity is important, and I quote him again. If we accept the linked scholastic account of God's nature as dynamic, as pure act, then this doctrine means that God does one thing, and that is to be God, perfectly, eternally, and incomprehensibly. And Turretin again agrees that simplicity can be deduced from his activity because God is the most pure act, having no passive admixture and therefore rejecting all composition. So in the Bible, God is often described not just by abstract names like truth, righteousness, life, light, love, and wisdom, among many others, but also concretely with regards to his actions. So being truthful, righteousness, living, illuminating, loving, and wise. And I have the list of texts that we can see from Jeremiah, John, 1 Corinthians, 1 John, and probably many others. All these references about God signify his simplicity, which, as another theologian, Adonis Vidu, puts it this way: simplicity define agency in a distinct way and differentiate it from any human agency. So in short, what I want to communicate is that simplicity is affirmed throughout history to maintain a strict creator and creature distinction, both in terms of their natures and also their actions or agencies. So although the concept of simplicity itself seems to defy logic and might seem irrational to some people, it continues to have some tractions and recognized as important because the doctrines allows God to define logic, for he is the ground of all rules and rule itself, and as such is utterly unique. I'm quoting from another theologian historian, Gavin Ortlund, from one of his articles about simplicity. So all that to say that it is important to not just affirm simplicity in relation to other attributes of God. So let us now go into some of the three important doctrines why simplicity is important. So earlier I mentioned about the Westminster Confession. So if we know Westminster Confession, chapter or section number 2, it has 3 sections. The first and second explaining about the attributes of God, but then they continue with the third, which is about the Trinity, and they start with these words: in the unity of the Godhead, there be 3 persons of one substance, power, and eternity, God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Ghost. And it continues. So Turretin, for example, as he lists all the doctrines that almost all the Reformed Orthodox agree to be counted among the so-called fundamental articles of faith, which means those teachings that are essential to maintain Christian orthodoxy. For Turretin, it's not enough just to emphasize the Trinity, but also he included the unity of God. And as Herman Bavinck rightly stresses, that the oneness of God does not only consist in the unity of singularity, but also unity of simplicity. So it is no wonder, again, Richard Moller can claim that from the time of the Father onwards, divine simplicity was supposed to be understood as a support of the doctrine of the Trinity, not contradicting the doctrine. And it's interesting, again, this is related to why the doctrine is somehow lost. Simon Chan, the famous Singaporean Pentecostal theologian, he wrote Grassroots Asian Theology, and he mentions that the negative influence of Jürgen Moltmann's tritheistic tendencies, tritheistic model of the Trinity, is making difficult, that Christians can communicate, especially about God, to the Muslims. So it's interesting. Later I'll mention again what Chan suggested, but it is interesting because in my context, earlier I mentioned there's one systematic theology just get published. So the person is, he's named Yoas Adiprasatya. He is also heavily influenced by Moltmann. So if you see the systematic theology that just got published, if you see the reference list, you can see that Moltmann, and then, all the dashes are so long. I mean, he relies so much on Moltmann, and especially in his earlier works as well. Again, I find that Adiprasatya is better than Moltmann because he doesn't reject explicitly monotheism like Moltmann did. So he's somewhat better. But again, the more common categories that he uses is perichoresis instead of simplicity. Somehow, because he is convinced that it can be enough, be sufficient to maintain the oneness of the Trinity somehow. But again, I'm bringing some of the critique from some other writers. So James Dolezal, again, rightly calls into question, and rightly in my opinion, that many recent attempts, not just by non-evangelical, but including evangelical theologians and evangelical analytic philosophers. We heard from the question, for example, Bill Craig. And many of them, they try to construct the Trinity without simplicity, and precisely because they think that simplicity and Trinity are two mutually exclusive ideas. So then many of them opt for what James Dolezal called the compositional models of divine unity, or sometimes it can be called social Trinitarianism, and very much depends on the idea of perichoresis. And again, many of the go-to guy for the concept of perichoresis is Jürgen Moltmann again. But James Dolezal rightly comments on this one, and he insists that without a sufficiently strong doctrine of simplicity, it becomes unclear why the 3 persons are not 3 gods. And likewise, Gavin Ortlund that I mentioned also finds that perichoresis alone is not enough. And I quote him here. The reason is that divine simplicity is able to bind 3 persons not merely into each other, but into the one divine essence. So strictly on the grounds of interpenetration, we are left further to explain why the interpenetration of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit does not entail 3 interpenetrating gods. Why should the interpenetration of three persons yield one undivided unity and not some complex aggregate? What is indeed not simply a mechanism by which to bring the divine persons into proximity with each other in the circulation of divine life, but a mechanism by which to unite the divine persons as one? So again, he mentions that where perichoresis may make oneness among the three persons possible, divine simplicity makes it necessary. Strong word. But I think he's right. So in other words, Ortlund does not argue that we should discard perichoresis. No. So if we glean from the theologian John of Damascus, who uses and employs a lot of perichoresis in his writing, he couples it with simplicity. That's what we should understand, about those theologians who uses a lot of perichoresis. So this is also, so Ortlund makes a good clarification of that. And so I think the point is that if we only rely on perichoresis instead of simplicity, it's somehow not enough. And if we trace the history, again, this is Thomas Joseph White's idea, one of the famous Dominican theologian. He mentions why the churches started to get serious about simplicity is because of two persons. First, Gilbert of Poitiers and also Joachim of Fiore. And if you know those two guys, they are considered as tri-theists. And since then, there's this one council led prominently by Bernard of Clairvaux, defending against Gilbert. And then the other one, Joachim of Fiore, was condemned in the Fourth Lateran Council, where it has the specific mention that divine simplicity is necessary there. So again, that's why this discussion, I think, helps us to see, simplicity helps make the oneness of God necessary. And what about the incarnation? So I gave the title of section regarding the incarnation is the Communicatio Idiomatum and the telos of the incarnation. It's interesting that some theologians have coupled, the idea that God is simple in the sense that it's rich, not just like one as in the one number, but it's rich. So, for example, there's this one theologian, Pseudo Dionysius, again, already mentioned earlier. He says that the unity and diversity of the simple God can illumine our understanding about the telos of the incarnation, including the redemption of all things. So Pseudo Dionysius called God the principle of simplicity for those turning towards simplicity, point of unity for those made one. And he goes further to say that the one God, in his supernatural simplicity and indivisible unity, possess the unifying power by which we are led to unity. We, in the diversity of what we are drawn together by it and led into a godlike oneness, into a unity reflecting God. So, and he says precisely in this place that the incarnation of the Son is sort of the bridge between the two. And he comments on the incarnation as, I quote, "The simplicity of Jesus becomes something complex. The timeless took on the duration of the temporal." And we are also reminded by the quote Athanasius, right? He indeed assumed humanity that we might become God, or something along those lines. But the question again, so when theologians couple the incarnation with the telos, which is the redemption and glorification of all things, the question remains, do we become part of God or do we become God? And again, here I quote Moltmann because he's also using the language of the incarnation and especially the Communicatio Idiomatum to imagine, the sort of the final eschatological state. And he mentioned that again, he's coupling the concept of perichoresis. So I quote him, "The mutual indwellings of God in his creation then issue in a cosmic communicatio idiomatum, a communication of idioms, to use a scholastic phrase, And that is to say, mutual participation in the attributes of the other, end quote. That's really interesting, right? I think he's onto something. But is he right in understanding and his use of communicatio idiomatum and coupling it with the final eschatological states? So I write here that if we're not careful, like Moltmann, and including probably other Lutheran theologians who teach us that there can be a kind of genus majestaticum resulting from the communicatio, and it is difficult not to fall into panentheism or even pantheism. But then, if we have the right understanding of communicatio idiomatum, which is taught by Turretin, I think it's interesting. And Turretin utilizes simplicity again to explain, how the communicatio idiomatum does not mean transfer of attributes. So first of all, he describes that in the incarnation, the Son of God is God-man, not by composition, but by hypostatical union. And he explains by which the Word indeed assumed human nature in one hypostasis, but was not compounded with it as part with part, but stood to it in the relation of perfecter and sustainer to make perfect and sustain an essential adjunct, so that the human nature indeed did thence receive perfection. And he continues on explaining the verse that's sometimes interpreted as panentheistic, which is Acts 17:28. In him we live, we move, and have our being. And he understands that verse as something like this. So I quote him again. We are called the race and offspring of God, not by participation of the same essence, but by similarity of likeness, efficiently, not essentially. And then he explains how simplicity can also clarify that the communicatio idiomatum does not mean their attributes of God somehow get mixed with the humans. So he was answering the question of the Lutherans whether there are some, probably just some attributes that gets transferred, like the ubiquity, omniscience, or maybe omnipotence are communicated. And his answer is no, because, and I quote him again, either all the properties of the divine nature were communicated or none, because they are inseparable and really one. Now, of the things which are really one being communicated, and the other is necessarily communicated. And in other words, God's simplicity hinders him also from being compounded with any created things so as to hold the relation of some part, either of matter or form. This is so both because he is altogether diverse from creatures and he is immutable, again, the word immutable, and incorruptible. From this section, it's clear that simplicity can safeguard, for us not to confuse the creator and creature distinction. And now we move on to the atonement part, which I'm going to be a little bit quickly here because I want to move on to the next one, which is the apologetic section. But here again, I think in the last decades or so, I think there's a great development regarding the doctrine of the atonement. But I think there are only some of them make use of simplicity. And this also occurs in the Indonesian context. But again, I want to quote and single out the work of Adonis P. Du. Again, in his book, Atonement, Law, and Justice, he has one chapter on the importance of affirming simplicity to understanding the agencies of God in relation to the atonement and also to understand the law of God. But he summarizes a few points, so I only highlight two here. So the first, divine simplicity means that we should not emphasize one divine attribute against another as if there's a conflict between them. So for example, there's a popular understanding that before Jesus came and died on the cross, there's a strife in God's being between, for example, his compassion and justice, or his love and holiness, and probably other things. And there are indeed some biblical texts that explicitly mention that. For example, in Hosea 11. And some people also misunderstand the atonement, for example, as something that Jesus must done to appease the Father from anger, just like the pagans, who require sacrifice from, maybe it's a child or something, to be appeased of the anger, Or even there's another language sometimes being written that the Father is wrathful toward the Son and that he must punish Jesus on the cross. So these are kind of the popular misunderstanding, I think, of the atonement. But I think some of these errors can be mitigated by understanding divine simplicity again. So by understanding simplicity, it is in fact impossible to think that there's a strife or conflict between God's justice and mercy, for example. It is also an overly anthropomorphic reading of texts that seem to indicate change from wrath to love in God, when there are clearly other texts that indicate otherwise. And again, the language of the Father punishing the Son contradicts the classic dictum, opera trinitatis ad extra sunt indivisa, another jargon probably, but it just means the outer works of the Trinity are undivided. And here, I quote the great New Testament scholar I. Howard Marshall. His comments are really spot on in one book, especially responding to some of these development in atonement theology. So he says, and I quote, "There's an indissoluble unity between the Father, Son, and Spirit in the work of redemption, the recognition that it is God the Son, that is to say, quite simply God, who suffers and dies on the cross, settles the question finally. This is God himself bearing the consequences of sin, not the abuse of some cosmic child." That last phrase, again, it's instructive, right? Because that is so many of our liberal progressive friends, and taken the idea from the modernity, they thought that, for example, penal substitution is like a cosmic child abuse, which is clearly wrong. I mean, understood again from the perspective of simplicity and divine accommodation in scriptures. So again, I think doctrine of divine simplicity protects us from making those kinds of mistakes and help us to read scripture better. And secondly, with regards to the atonement, divine simplicity also implies that we cannot prioritize one model or theory of the atonement and pit it against one or the other. So on the other hand, there's a tendency nowadays that we want to incorporate every theory as if they're the same. But on the other hand, people say that, okay, one theory can stand alone and the other can go by their own, basically isolating one from one another. There's a case study in Indonesia where there's one liberal scholar wrote a book criticizing penal substitution as something like cosmic child abuse as well. And there's one theologian that I mentioned earlier, Yoas Adiprasetya. He wrote another book to counter his colleague, actually. And part of his response is interesting. He mentioned something like this. Okay, if penal substitution is overturned, then so what? We have so many others. Christus Victor, moral exemplarism, among many others. As if the rejection of penal substitution doesn't matter or won't crash the building, so to speak. And there's another evaluator or commentator looking at the debate also agrees that what the liberal theologian is doing is only throwing a stone because he's only damaging a little. But from the perspective of simplicity, again, this is impossible. Because as another theologian, Adam Johnson, I quote him, the divine attributes stand at the center of any theory of the atonement, shaping its constituent parts and determining its insights and limitations. So again, I think those extreme tendencies can be alleviated by understanding the right doctrine of simplicity. So it's not just that every theory are separated or everything is right, but we have to find a way to put it into and integrate them together. So there's one recent attempt by Joshua McNall, for example. He wrote a book called The Mosaic of the Atonement. It's a good attempt to integrate all from recapitulation to moral exemplarism. But as far as I can see, he didn't make use of much of simplicity, for example. So I think it makes it a little bit harder for him to do that. Hopefully I can still have time to go on the next one, which is the apologetic function. So we have seen, even from the dogmatic function, simplicity is indispensable. But what about the apologetic function? So continuing, earlier I mentioned about Simon Chan. He mentions and he continues, so Moltmann is a bad influence. So how should we dialogue with Muslims? And he mentioned that a better case could be presented to the Muslims via the Thomistic conception of the Trinity. And he goes on to say how Thomas's concept of God as pure act, and he put in bracket, simple, perfect, without potentiality and change, and of the divine operations such as generation and processions might serve as a better point of contact between Muslim and Christians. And why is that? He explains, because such an understanding of God makes distinction in God conceivable without compromising the divine perfection and otherness. I agree wholeheartedly with him, and that's what the medieval Arab Christian thinkers did as they dialogue with Muslims. So actually, there's just one book that we can rely upon. So it's from a book by Sarah Husseini. It's called Early Christian-Muslim Debate on the Unity of God. Three Christian scholars and their engagement with Islamic thought. So I'm going to summarize basically the content of the book in just a few minutes, I suppose. So the three Arab Christian theologians that is highlighted in the book, their names are Theodore Abu Qurra, Abu Raita al-Takriti, Ammar al-Basri. So these three, but I just want to mention and highlight Abu Raita because he was the one who said something perfect from something perfect. But it's interesting that the three have commonalities in the way they dialogue with Muslims. So there are some apologetic steps that they usually do. So the first one, they set up some common ground with the Muslims by arguing that Christians also believe in the one God, monotheism. They also seem to understand that the Islamic understanding of God, so they will specify the attributes that they can agree upon, but also at the same time qualifying, the different understanding of oneness that we teach, about God and their understanding. So these apologists understand, and they clarify. And the second step, after that is established, they will make the move to argue for the Trinity through the simple essence or substance of God, especially by showing how the Muslims have tended to misunderstand what the doctrine of simplicity entails. And the third step and additional part is they make frequent use of logic, especially Aristotelian categories and philosophy, to define terms, make distinctions. So in this regard, they also employ everyday analogies in a careful and qualified way. So, for example, Abu Raita that I mentioned, he started with listing all the attributes of God, and he mentioned specifically that the Muslims understand and have in the Quran. For example, he mentions not only that God is one, but God is without companion. And he is also the first and the last, the creator of the seen and the unseen, etc., etc. And then he adds, God is elevated above imperfection and incapacity. So coupling the simplicity plus the pure act understanding. And he continues that God is not described by division nor partition. So again, he's very specific about that. And he mentions that in the Quran, some of these are mentioned. So again, he's establishing what Muslim understands and what Christians also affirm. And in this regard, also the other theologian, Ammar al-Basri, also mentions that without a doubt, God in his substance and unique in his nature, so division does not reach him and partition does not apply to him. So they use the same language that we can understand that as simplicity. And then, again, they establish that, okay, you guys can agree with those kinds of concepts. But, so people like Abu Raita will, again, quickly, he would qualify, but we have a different understanding. Especially why? Because a lot of Muslims thought that we worship three gods. So they understood the Trinity as denoting three. But then Abu Raita would cleverly, I guess, he would say that what we meant by one does not mean just numbers, but we meant one in substance or in essence. So he's quick to, clarify all this distinction, and he turned it to the Muslims who say, well, of course you understand God as one, but you don't say that God is one like the number, right? Well, if you say God is just like number one, what about the other numbers? And he pointed out that the Muslims are actually not honoring God by putting more numbers. If you understand that in terms of numbers, again, but of course the Muslim doesn't want to accept that, as Abu Raita would say. But again, he uses that to say Christians also doesn't just mean when we say God is one yet in three person, it doesn't mean numbers. So he's clearing the ground after he's setting the common ground. So it's interesting, right? And so he makes a use of analogy. So for example, another apologist, Theodore Abukura, he uses analogy, maybe the one that we often hear, the sun and the ray and the heat. Of course, we feel the heat from the sun, but we don't say that the sun and the heat are separate, although they can be distinguished. So in a way, so again, Abukura mentions that it's something like that. So the attributes of God can be distinguished, but they're not separated from him. For example, like Abukura and also Ammar, for example, they use the analogy, and then they move on to another part where Muslims are familiar. Maybe if you know that Muslims have the word kalimatullah, so the word of God. So he used something like this. So does God have a word? What is the position or the status of the word? Is it something that is part of God? Now the Muslims would reject that because Muslims don't understand that the word, especially if you understand Muslim theology, they have the Quran in the eternal something there in Surah 85. But clearly they won't say that the word of God is separate from God, because that would make like two eternal and two perfect beings, right? Which is incoherent, of course. But again, these theologians are trying to set up common ground as well as at the same time they're distinguishing, and again, from those kinds of distinctions and qualifications, they move in with the Trinity. And I guess I don't have time to explain how then they explains how the persons, are somehow like God at God's attributes. So they are not part of God, but they are God himself, but manifested or, revealed to us in different modes of relations. But basically, if you pay attention to all these three theologians, they all use divine simplicity. And imagine if we don't have that doctrine. I think it would make it really difficult, to dialogue with Muslims. and to have that common ground, even though it's, of course, not exactly the same. And my argument also why simplicity is important is witnessed by a recent article. So Define Simplicity has received many objections, like the modal collapse objections. For example, if you guys are nerds like me, maybe you know the term. But there's this one philosopher, Islamic philosopher, who defended that objection by using Jonathan Edwards and by appealing to simplicity and appealing to basically the classical understanding of divine freedom. I know that Jonathan Edwards is a bit controversial, but I think he got the basic points correct. So it's interesting that there's this lots of common grounds between us and the Muslims. And so it's a great opportunity for us, I think. And we will lose so much if we do not rely on simplicity to dialogue with Muslims. So I'll conclude with saying that I think not only that simplicity is dogmatically and apologetically important and indispensable. So I was wondering, again, back to my context, Indonesian context, why has people never heard of simplicity? Maybe people think that it's not familiar because it's unimportant. But I think it's like the condition or situation that Indonesians do not feel that philosophy, for example, is important. So from primary school down to even the university, you won't get a single philosophy class or logic or anything if you're not enrolled in a philosophy program. But does that mean that, Indonesians don't need philosophy? I mean, personal experience, I learned philosophy, it helps me a lot, and it opens me up to broader understanding of God and the intricacies of it. So it doesn't mean that philosophy is unimportant, but people just don't know what it is for. So I think in our doing theology, and especially in Indonesian context, and I'm sure in many contexts as well, we need to do better, to show people why this doctrine or that doctrine is important and point them out to the consequences of what it means to lose those doctrines. And simplicity, I hope, is one of them. And hopefully I've shown enough, for us not to reject simplicity, but to continue to develop it and defend it further. Thank you.